Hey everybody, welcome back. James here again with you, and today I want to cover a topic that has been floating around for a while ever since the Venturi Avengers have came to the market, and that is POI shifting. Now what does that mean? Point of impact is what it's short for, at a certain distance. Now the shifting part could be multiple things. I've been asked by multiple people my take on it, and the thing is with it is that I have never noticed it, and I shoot my 22 Venturi Avenger every day, literally, and the reason why I've really never noticed it, for one, is that I'm always adjusting my settings for different reasons, whether it's video purposes, pellet testing, whatever the case may be. But I have been asked by many to test out and figure out why it happens. So what I did was I went down to my low regulator setting of 1800 psi, and I know a lot of guys, and I get the comments, I see it, go lower than that, but that is the perfect setting for my gun, the way it sits. And I tuned it in with just, I think, two or three turns. I left the gun the same settings throughout this whole video, and I was shooting the cross from the Premier hollow points. Now I started out at 50 yards, and a couple things I wanted to test was I noticed a lot of comments, whether it's on Facebook, YouTube, or wherever, and messages that the Venturi Avenger regulator, you know, once it hits a certain spot on the fill pressure, because again you're filling up higher than your regulator setting, obviously. Well, the Venturi Avenger in any caliber has a 4350 psi fill. Well, if you're filling all the way up, I can see that you have a POI shift, and it does happen. Now, like I said, I haven't noticed it because I never really filled it up all the way and shot it all the way down because I didn't care to. I'm always changing the settings. I'm always tuning every day for a certain reason. But again, I left the gun the same settings, and I've been testing literally for like the past 2 weeks straight with the gun the same settings, same muzzle velocity, same pellet. And there's a couple things I noticed when I started testing. Now, when I started shooting, I filled it all the way up, and I started noticing around the 3600, 3500 psi mark that I had a significant shift on target. And this was at 50 yards, and we're talking inches. So yes, I could see that people mentioning, you know, that with the regulator, the way it sets, depending on your fill pressure, it can mess with it. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that now of the difference that I was getting on impact. All right, here we go with the Venturi Avenger 22 cal, fill pressure above 3500 psi. And dry fired 2 times. Should be spot on here. Using the mill dot right above the crosshair. See how close it is. Okay, here's 5 shots. Just a hair left of the vertical crosshair at 50 yards, using 1 mil dot reference at the top of the target. Above 3500 psi fill. Alright, next 5 shots here at around 3000 psi fill. See if there's a POI shift. Same point of aim. Same settings, everything. Yep. And as you've seen there, I had the gun the same settings, 1800 psi, filling it above the 3600 psi mark, and I shot below that mark, letting the air out, degassing it, and I had a sporadic group like that. Now, what is the cause of that? Well, the regulator is set at 2900 psi, or what it's rated for, I should say. And yes, you can go all the way down, and according to the manual, you can almost go all the way closed on the regulator, but you have to crack it open. Now, here's the problem. You're really restricting the air. You're really choking the air with the regulator set that low. I've been seeing people comment and saying that they've had their regulator set, 1000 to 1400 psi, which is fine. But you have to remember, and I've started noticing this, that your fill pressure seems to be messing with your regulator if it's double that pressure. So with my regulator pressure, again, being 1800 psi, double that is 3600 psi. So that makes sense that it would mess with it, because it's more than 2 times the regulator pressure. So how do you fix that problem? How do you fix the POI shifting like that? And if you noticed on the group, they were grouping above each other, but they were grouping diagonal on paper at 50 yards. So the question is, how do you fix that? Well, you don't fill above either 3600 psi if your regulator's set that high. If you have a regulator set, lower than that, you just double that number. And I know people are going to say, well, that's going to restrict my shot count. It's not about the shot count. Yeah, you could sit there and shoot your gun a million times, but then you can't whine and cry about, your point of impact shifting, because that's not how it works, unfortunately. Now, also, to fix that problem though, if you're wondering about why it's doing that, like I said, you can either just shoot below the double number of your regulator setting. So if your setting is 1400, that means don't shoot above 2800 psi in the fill pressure. But if you're like me and I shoot on the high side, I always shoot on the high side of the regulator. I don't always shoot at 2900 psi, but I shoot around the high side more than the halfway mark of the regulator rating. I went up to 2200 psi, because it only makes sense if you double that 2200 psi, it equals 4400 psi. And guess what? The fill pressure for the Venturi Avenger is 4350. So that means that if I fill my gun all the way up, I should have no POI shifting. Now, that doesn't mean that the groups might not be affected, like how tight, they are on paper, because you're really increasing the pressure, how much that flows through the gun. And I've noticed that too. Depending on certain pressures, your gun just does not group as good at certain pressures. But since I raised that regulator pressure up to 2200 psi, again, the same velocity, I hit the same velocity as I did at the 1800 psi. I had to turn the hammer spring in a little more, and the group, there was no split in the group. There was no two different groups on impact. They all impacted the same spot. So that's how you fix that part. So check this out. All right, I got it filled back up to 4K, and I know exactly where it's landing at. So let's see if it's the same spot. Okay. Now I'm going to degas it. All right, degas down to 3,000. Let's see what happens here. Well, not getting any POI shifting there. The group isn't the best I've ever seen, but it's just because they're not tuned in. But I'm not getting that crazy, sporadic 1 mil, 2 mil, half a mil, all over the place POI shifting. So now that you have seen that the Venturi Avenger, once you get the regulator set just right, and you're not going to have that big of a shift like that, especially the groups splitting off in each other when you're shooting at certain different pressures. Now, with that said, again, it may affect your shot count, but you know, I fill mine up with the air compressor and a bottle, so I'm not going to be hand pumping anymore. I've done that for years, and I'm not going to do it anymore. Now, again, and that might help you guys out there with a hand pump. If you're sitting there shooting, you know, with your regulator set so low, just don't go above the double pressure of the regulator, and you won't get that shift, and you won't have to pump it that long. It just makes logical sense because you're not filling it up that much. And yeah, you might not get that many shots, but at the same time, I'd rather not miss what I'm aiming at, especially a 2-inch difference or so at 50 yards. So now, once I figured that out, there's another problem that I ran into, and this one I cannot solve because it's out of my control. And you're probably thinking, what are you talking about, James? How is it out of your control? Well, it's the weather. Believe it or not, you know, I've said this many times in previous videos that depending on the weather and the climate and the humidity in the air, and here recently it's been crazy humid out, it plays a huge effect on pellet flight because the way the pellets fly in the air and trajectory. I've not noticed this with my 25 caliber, but I think it's because it's a bigger projectile and it flies through the air, you know, obviously being a bigger pellet and more weight. But with the 22 caliber pellets and even slugs, I've seen it where the humidity, you know, depending on it, the humidity, if you look it up, humidity can affect the trajectory of pellets. And if the humidity is really high, especially above the temperature outside, I've noticed a huge impact change. Like I'm talking, you know, 2 to 3 inches at 25 yards. And this is just something that you cannot control. But that's just, you know, that's part of it, unfortunately, with air guns. I haven't noticed this with my experience again, you know, with 22 rimfire. But air guns, for some odd reason, with the pellets the way they are and designed the way they fly and their ballistic coefficient, because the previous video I've done, as you know, downrange, the pellets increase their ballistic coefficient. So if they're catching that air from being so humid, it's just basically like a ramp for the pellets, and they are staying in flight longer and not dropping as fast, basically, if you think about it like that. And they're just shooting super high. And again, especially at 25 yards. So that's just one thing you can't control is the weather, unfortunately. Now, if you have a climate controlled range, that's a different story. But again, I shoot out in the elements every day and I can't control that. And that's the only thing I cannot control. But I just thought I would share this with you guys. If you're having a POI shift with your groups, you know, and their groups are splitting off in 2 different parts of your target, depending on where you're shooting at, once you hit different pressure levels, you got to adjust the regulator. And other than that, or you just don't fill it up all the way. And I've even went and tested this even further and thought maybe it was the scope or something else, and it's not. The thing that's changing every day is the weather, unfortunately. You know, depending on the temperature outside and the humidity and all that and the air density. I've even brought the gun in. I left the gun outside this whole time, this whole testing period, you know, to get to the temperature of outside and shoot. Then I've even brought it in to try, and I've still got the same results, the same point of impact on target. And it's just, it blows my mind how much of a difference each day that I shoot, that shooting the same pellet at the same velocity changes on target. Now, in theory, it should be only vertical. It shouldn't be left or right. If you're shooting the same spot every day, it should be just a vertical rise or vertical drop on target. So again, I am getting a significant shift at 25 yards now, even with the humid air, but it's all vertical. It's never left or right. So that just tells you right there that if the gun is tuned perfectly, in theory, that's what it should be, is only vertical point of impact shifts and not a left or right impact shift. So again, that's something I can't control, and the only best thing I could do is just try to get the pellet to the right trajectory that I want and try to minimize that difference on target every day, day to day by day, and get ready for hunting season. Because, you know, the margin of error, I want to cut down the margin of error when I'm hunting to as little as possible, you know, especially if I'm going to be freehand or supporting offhand shooting with my air rifles when I'm out hunting in the woods. So I thought I would share this method to help you guys out there. Again, there's two ways you can do it, and you can either just not fill up your gun all the way, just double your regulator pressure that you have, and you should not notice a POI change, or turn your regulator up if you want the full fill of your air gun. And again, this is only something that I've noticed with 22. I've even tried my 25 and I haven't noticed it, and I think it's just because it's a bigger pellet and it's not as noticeable because it's heavier. 22, obviously, the projectiles are lighter, and with the way that the air is changing day by day with humidity and temperature, like I said, it seems like it's a ramp. The molecules in the air, water molecules being so humid, seem like a ramp for the pellets the way they fly. And since they're not losing their ballistic coefficient, then gaining it downrange, it's what it seems like on target, and that's what I'm getting. So anyways, guys, I hope this video helps you figure out your POI shifts. Again, I have been testing this for weeks and weeks to help many people out that have asked me and, you know, private message me and all this and that to help solve their POI issues. So again, I hope this helps you guys out there, and definitely let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.